Around 1 a.m. of August 12, 2003, the station received a report from a 72-year-old lady named Martha Brown about a strange man standing outside their house. She claimed that this man in a coat was standing there for hours while staring at her window. She ignored him at first and went to bed around 10 p.m. When she got up to go to the bathroom, she decided to take a peek through the window to see if the man was still there, and he was. Assumed that he must be some kind of a stalker, but a person standing at the same spot for hours was unheard of. Regardless of his business with Mrs. Brown, I went to her house to ask the man directly what he was doing there. When I arrived at the residence, he was still there. I talked to Mrs. Brown to verify if the man across the street was the same person she was referring to. She nodded her head in agreement and said that she was watching him closely before I arrived, and he didn't move an inch since then. I approached the man standing completely still with his eyes locked at Mrs. Brown's window. He wasn't even blinking. He was roughly 8 feet tall with a slender physique. Aside from his height that towered over mine, what really caught my attention was the eerie expression on his face. He was smiling from ear to ear with his eyes wide open. He had a long, crooked nose and his ears were quite wide. He was wearing a bowler hat and a dark brown coat that was noticeably puffed despite of his slender figure. I took a step back to keep a safe distance since he might have something under the coat. I asked what his business was with the lady across the street. I referred to Mrs. Brown without giving out her name, although it was clear that he was staring at her window and there was nobody else around the area to make a complaint. I asked for his identification, and I also asked how long he was standing there. However, the strange man ignored all of my inquiries and remained completely still. It was rather bizarre to stand in front of him. It seemed he was in a very deep trance and almost lifeless. He looked like a mannequin with oversized facial features rather than an actual person, and that strange smile on his face was quite unsettling. I decided to raise my voice. It was also dark outside, and so I shone a light right on his face to get his attention. Oddly enough, he didn't blink still. His eyes didn't even react to the light like how it naturally would. However, I was finally able to get a reaction. In a very slow manner, the strange man leveled his head and looked to my direction. Once again, I asked for an identification and his reason for being there very late at night. However, with all his teeth in full display, his disturbing grin remained on his long, pale face and did not answer my questions. For the third time, I spoke with more authority to force him to comply, but it was then when I heard a very unsettling noise. It sounded like hundreds of teeth gnashing against each other, and it seemed it was coming from within his coat. Unexpectedly, the strange man suddenly made a very wide movement. He turned his back on me and strode. I couldn't even explain how physically unnatural it was to see him making such a sudden turn and then gaining some distance from where I stood with just a single stride. His ankle would have snapped, and he must be wearing some kind of rollerblades to slide so effortlessly on a rough surface. Just when I thought it couldn't get any weirder, I was completely dumbfounded when he disappeared right before my eyes. I may not have had a good sleep that time since I was on night shift for days, but I would swear on my mother's life that I was not hallucinating. I was right on his tail, and my eyes were locked onto him as I was running after him just roughly 8 to 9 feet away. All of a sudden, he vanished. It looked as if he made a sharp turn downwards like running on a completely 90-degree wall and then falling. However, it happened right on a flat street which didn't even have a manhole. There was no explanation to what I just saw. I filed a report and said that the man ran from me when I asked for his ID, and he got away surprisingly quickly. Some of the officers did not believe me for obvious reasons. I had a car, and the man escaped on foot. I told some of my colleagues at the station what really happened, and they believed that version of report much less than what I officially submitted. I asked Mrs. Martha Brown if she knew anyone that might have a grudge against her and send a stalker to her place, which in itself already sounded quite ridiculous. I just needed her to make an official statement since it was the procedure. Nothing at that point made any sense, but then she mentioned something about the weird phone calls she was receiving. A few weeks before the man appeared outside of her home, Mrs. Brown had received a strange number of calls on her landline phone. Whenever she answered the call, she wouldn't hear anything but a static noise. She decided to ignore it at first, thinking it was nothing but some kids making prank calls. But then the calls began to affect other things in her house. She mentioned that her television and lights started to act up whenever the phone rang. The channels would suddenly lose signals while the lights kept on blinking. She reported the issue to her cable service provider and also called in an electrician to check if there were problems with the wires or anything of that sort. However, both of them said that whatever she was experiencing was not coming from their ends. At the last previous calls that she received prior to the appearance of the strange man, she also began to hear a faint sound of grinding teeth along with the static noise at the other end of the line. Coincidentally, this description was oddly similar to what I heard from the man before he ran away and disappeared. I didn't know what to make of this case. I simply couldn't wrap my head around the fact that a person just vanished right before me, and Mrs. Brown's statement didn't make it any easier to understand what was happening. If I didn't know any better, I would easily say that whoever or whatever, the man must not be of this world. I couldn't believe a simple report of a stalker late at night would be my first encounter to something that I would never understand. But as a police officer, I had to stick to whatever made more sense since that is how cases are solved. The face of the tall, strange man in a coat was embedded in my memory, and it haunted me in my sleep. That eerie grin on his face, his long, crooked nose, his pale skin and seemingly lifeless demeanor, the way he moved, and the sound of grinding teeth under his coat. I kept on wondering what it might be, but somehow I was glad that I didn't see it. In a way, I could tell that whatever it was would terrify me to the core. On September 2nd of the same year, exactly 3 weeks since the incident, Mrs. Martha Brown called the station again with the same report. But this time around, she sounded afraid and frantic. While on the phone, Mrs. Brown could hardly talk properly due to panic, and she said that the strange man was right on her doorstep. Needless to say, I did not waste a single second and rushed to her home along with 2 more officers right away. We already left while the others were talking to her on the phone. As they were advising her what to do in her dire situation, the next things they heard were her screams of terror and the gnashing of countless teeth. According to the officer on the line, it sounded like a mob of people aggressively grinding their teeth to pieces all at once. All of a sudden, it went quiet. When we arrived at Mrs. Brown's house, we did not see any sign of forced entry. I assumed that this strange man could easily pass through the door since I saw him diving down in asphalt before. Since there was no time to explain, I decided to break the door down given the situation. With guns in our hands, we cautiously searched inside the house. When we didn't find her there, we searched the surrounding area as well. She was clearly taken by force because of what we heard on the phone, but we were totally clueless where to go from there. Sadly, we never found Mrs. Martha Brown nor any trace of her whereabouts. Despite of encountering the suspect firsthand, I had no idea at all where he might have taken her. I wasn't even sure if he was human at all. The case remained unsolved, and the identity of the tall man in the coat remained a mystery.